Good morning. Continuing review, summary, conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We're in volume 3, page 1465. We finished the paragraph on 1465, Aleph Tov Samachay, discussing the very process of how a Nefesh Elokis influences, impacts, educates, trains, harnesses the Nefesh Habamis. And a very actually practical detail, the Rebbe Rashab laid it out after first establishing the very concept of the difference between Nefesh Elokis and Nefesh Habamis, that they're diametrically opposed because Nefesh Habamis is in Klippas Nega. The Chochmah and wisdom and intelligence of the animal soul is Nega, which means that it's not directed towards Kedusha, it's directed towards its self-interest. And even the intelligence that is not directly about a person's personal needs is also around the Gashmis and the Yeshis and the Chumrius, as he put it, of existence. Nefesh Elokis, on the other hand, it comes from higher than the Shvira, which means its Chachma is, and its entire being. Well, I should add, the Nefesh Habamis, that's the Seichel, and the Midas of the Nefesh Habamis are clearly hardwired impulses about the self. The Seichel, the Nefesh Elokis, on the other hand, is all about Elokus. So its mind is focused exclusively, he said. Doesn't have any other interest except godliness, to see the Ruchnius, the godliness and everything. And its Midas are hardwired in the Nefesh Elokis, Midas of loving and revering and connecting and having a relationship with Hashem, God. And yet Hashem put these two forces together to the point they become one Mahus, where the Keiches of Nefesh Elokis are mislabish in the Nefesh Habamis. So they don't remain separate. They are two separate entities, but they join together, literally like partners in everything we do. And thus, when the Nefesh Elokis is involved and engaged in understanding godliness, it's doing so through the levushim, through the lens of Dvarim Tivim, like you said, and Chumrim. Yes, it's seeing the godliness in it, but it's through the levush, like the Mishalim examples and comparisons and parallels, which of course conceals on the Etzem Ha'er, because the neshama without a guf and nefesh habamis would just understand the concept without any of its the lens, the physical lens. It wouldn't have these shades, or so-called a lens is the right word. Nevertheless, but when it comes down below, it does see it that way, and through that it comes to understand the inyan eliki. But then the Nefesh Elokis, when you strip it from the Gashmis, then you're left with the Etzem Ha'er, as he said in the parentheses. And the same thing with the Midas. Even though the Midas of Nefesh Elokis, so thus, I should go back a moment. So since the Seichel is mislabish and the Seichel HaTivi of the Nefesh Habamis can relate to it. Same thing with the Midas. That even though they also diametrically opposed, because the Midas, the emotions of Nefesh Elokis want godliness, chayfetz belikus, and the Nefesh Habamis bechumrius. Nevertheless, the way the chayfetz and ratzah of Nefesh Elokis works, kefi eifanat for the Nefesh Habamis, it also is through the lens of the Nefesh Habamis. And he gave the example when a person has a natural, the Nefesh Habamis is naturally chesed. So the Avodas Hashem, driven by the Nefesh Elokis, will also be through that kav. And if it's Gvura, he doesn't mention Gvura, but it would be similar. And now, what does this all tell us? Since the faculties, Keiches Nefesh Elokis, Mulabashim, Bekeiches Nefesh Habamis, Alkain, Ba'asagav is bonus the Nefesh Elokis. That's why, when the comprehension and the contemplation of the divine soul, Yiful says that also it'll affect that also the animal soul, in its natural intelligence, will understand this divine concept. So it's not just that the Nefesh Elokis understands it through Seichel HaTivi, but the Nefesh Elokis mishtadl u'misasik im HaSeichel HaTivi Nefesh Habamis. The Nefesh Elokis engages and mishtadl makes an effort, an exerted effort, a concerted effort and gets in, and engages with the seichel of the TV, that it should understand, and v'yunachetzle betev, and it should be internalized, and it should be well received, and well accepted, well integrated, and internalized by the seichel TV of the nefesh habamis. And then he concludes, the last thing we learn, and when the seichel TV understands and comprehends the inyan alikis, then when the nefesh alikis is beispailus, other beispailus amidus nefesh alikis, when through his abundance, of course, the nefesh alikis gets inspired, gets excited, gets emotional, gets passionate. So the ozai beispailus amidus b'ava b'dish be'esh, with the love, with the fiery flames of the love of love. Tislav v'tislai gam b'nefesh habamis b'hava. So also nefesh habamis will be ignited and also become infected by this passion, and therefore also will also have a certain measure of tislav. It just says tislav v'tislai gam b'nefesh habamis b'hava. That also nefesh habamis will be ignited and on fire with this love. That's where we stopped. Now he's going to explain the actual steps of how this works with the nefesh alikis, again, leading the way. And of course, it's all based on, let's not forget, the key thing to remember, that this doesn't happen automatically. Because nefesh habamis on its own is a behemoth, is interested in its own things, like we know. So it takes a real concerted effort, like we said, and it takes constant effort. And even when after the effort, as I mentioned from Tanya, after davening, it's an ongoing battle. That's the basis in Tanya. There's an ongoing battle. And by the tzaddik, he's won the battle. There's no more nefesh habamis. There's no yetzer hara. Harge b'tainis, or even more, transformed it. Like he explains in chapter 10 in Tanya, the two levels of tzaddik, the tevlev, tzaddik v'ray, tzaddik gomer, tzaddik sheina gomer. But we're talking here by a person who potentially is a beinoni, where the nefesh habamis is active. The question is, how much you have it under control, and it doesn't. How much it does in affecting the machshava dibra ma'isa of the person. So let's continue now. The new paragraph, page 1465. The kachu, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along the text. So he says, "V'kachu seder v'derech haveda," and thus, and this is the order and the process of the aveda, of the work, bebirur v'tikun the nefesh habamis, in the refinement and the repair. Tikkun krosa means the tikkun krosa means from the tikkunim are also like ornaments, so it's the beautification. But tikkun means to repair. Tikkun means to elevate. It includes many glasses lesakin. To adorn was the word. Sometimes we use it when we talk about the tikkunim are referred to like jewels, like jewelry. But in this context, it's the general birur and tikkun and refinement of the animal soul. So it's a seder b'derech haveda. There's a process. There's a methodology involved. It's another way of putting seder b'derech haveda. It's a very powerful expression. But eifin kazeh dafke, and it's dafke in this manner. So there's a very clear recipe here, formula, I should say, of how you do this. Shaseichel the nefesh habamis, to bring the intelligence of the animal soul, which on its own focuses on its own self, or on the yesh and the gashmi and ruchni and the chumri, yovin v'yasig alakus. How to bring this nefesh habamis to come understand and comprehend alakus. V'oz dafka, and dafka then when the nefesh habamis understands it, b'yiseres hamidus the nefesh alikis, then with the yiseres, with the arousal, with the stimulation, with the awakening of, or the expression of the midas of nefesh alikis, mispoil gama nefesh habamis, the nefesh habamis too will get excited and passionate, ba'avel alakus, the love to godliness. So this is critical. Two steps here: his bonus and his seder samidus. So we're going to learn about this more in detail, but let me just say this. If, for example, the Nefesh Abamis, who of course is residing all the time within us, is experiencing that the Nefesh Alikis, I'm just giving a real life example. It comes Shabbos or Yom Tov Shabbos, the person sits down, starts davening with a talus over their head, and a real Avedis Atfilah. Nefesh Alikis, the person is crying, the person is passionate, he's emotional. A Nevid, davening the way he's supposed to daven, davening to Hashem. And the Nefesh Alikis, of course, is contemplating ungodliness, and it's also leading to Ahava. Nefesh Abamis, just think about, let's just create a little scene here, like a little play. No? Imaginary play. Nefesh Abamis is watching all of this, and if it was just the emotions of the Nefesh Alikis, the Nefesh Abamis would perhaps obviously be affected. You see someone who's so passionate, it obviously affects you, but it wouldn't understand why. Because Nefesh Abamis, as I said on its own, its natural inclination is toward emotional passions and emotions that are around its own pleasure and its own desires and its own temptations. I'm not even getting to anything prohibited. It's hungry, it wants to eat, it's looking forward to a good kiddush, etc. However, being that we have here seichel hativi de nefesh habamis, and that means that the seichel of the nefesh can communicate, then it's a whole other story. Now the nefesh habamis can understand what the nefesh alikis is experiencing, and it makes sense, and it's actually intriguing. So then when the nefesh alikis comes alive in a fiery passion, nefesh habamis is not a complete stranger. It understands where it's coming from. It still needs to be affected by nefesh alikis. It doesn't happen on its own initially. Later stages, nefesh habamis can become more accustomed and ultimately be transformed. We'll talk about that. So we say, "V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha." The Shema Yisrael is what the Nefesh Alikis is contemplating on. It's being transferred by explanation, the Seichel TV, because Nefesh Alikis is using that to understand it well. Like I said yesterday, Rab Geshem Ber Pahara's expression, my Nefesh Abamis understands better Yiddish. So it's speaking, so the Nefesh Alikis is thinking and contemplating in the language of Seichel TV because it makes it more palatable when the Nefesh Alikis is down below. This, in turn, it can be understood by the Seichel TV of the Nefesh Abamis. So then, when the Nefesh Alikis comes alive in Vahafta, after Shema, is B'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. It doesn't just affect the right side of the heart where the Nefesh Alikis resides, as he says in Perik Tes and Tanya, but also the left side of the heart, where the Yetzer Hara resides, which is Molei Dam, the passions, and now it too is B'hafta. And he's explaining here literally the dynamics of how that works. So he's gonna now go on to explain more details, but I just wanted to lay that out. So it's quite powerful when you think about it, how it's a process. There's a method here. There's a Seder v'derech ha'aveda, b'birur v'tikun, the Nefesh Abamis. And it begins with his bananus and then leads to the midas. I'll just use one more example to make it even more practical. I mentioned mediation. When you're dealing with two people who are in conflict and have some disagreement, and it's gotten serious, meaning it's not just a superficial thing. They really have a strong disagreement to the point they don't even want to talk to each other. A good mediator will try to get them together. Before getting them together, you have to talk to each one of them and convince him that's in your interest to sit down with me and with the other person and let's talk it through. And the person will say, no, I disagree. I've tried everything. Nothing will help. And this can be between husband and wife. It could be, God forbid, between parents and children. It could be between partners in business, or many different engagements that people have, friends, strangers. What's the first step of the mediator? Is to get him to say, I understand your feelings. I understand that you really got hurt. You feel that you were ba'avelt. How do you say that in English? You were you were sorry. You were slighted, or even feel that you've suffered a loss or damages due to the other person. But I'm asking you just to listen to me. What are you really doing? You're trying to not bypass. You're trying to put aside right now the emotions, because the emotions are the real problem here. And try to talk seichel. Let's talk a little until, let's see, maybe we can find some opening. And when you're successful, you've basically gotten through that the person is saying, I'm not asking you to sign any agreements. I'm not asking you to negotiate. I'm not asking you to compromise. I'm not asking you even to change your feelings. Just ask you to listen. Essentially, you're trying to get to the seichel somewhat separate from the midas. Because if you go at the midas, if you attack the midas, it's going to be very difficult. Because the person is already all upset, resentful, angry, and maybe even legitimately. And you can't just talk to the midas. So you try to talk to the seichel. Once there's an opening on both ends that we at least can talk, then hopefully you could say something that makes sense. And the person says, okay, I'm open to that idea, and the other person says the same. Then you can start saying, and now let's see if the next step, can the midas be influenced as well? So the point is, yes, that because moyach shal ta'alev, like he says in Tanya, here he doesn't use that expression, but this talking to the seichel can then allow that one person to also respond to the other person's midas. Because then the next step of mediation is say, okay, we've come to a certain understanding, but now maybe you can express why you're so upset. And the person starts saying, you did so and so. They start accusations. So hopefully at that point, since there is already an opening, the person will say, if I'm the media, I'll say to the person, can you hear his feelings? Can you hear why he's upset? He says, yes, I can hear it. Why? Because the seichel was already engaged. If you didn't do that, they would just be fighting, and each one would say, you're the culprit, you're guilty. They point fingers, and we go nowhere. Here, you're opening up the possibility, so you could hear the other person. However, I heard what he said, but he's exaggerating. Or he's missing that he's first hurt me before I hurt him. I'm just throwing out scenarios. My point is that it's a process of how you first get people to listen, first with the seichel. Then the obidus would be more receptive to hear the other person's emotions. And the goal, obviously, is to actually be influenced and say, I understand you're hurt. I didn't realize what I did. Or both of them say, I didn't realize what happened. And slowly you can diffuse it. And ultimately, they can be friends again. They can be partners again. That's the ultimate goal. I went through more steps here. He doesn't really talk about the nefesh habamis resistance, fighting back with the nefesh halikis. He doesn't discuss, that's more in Tanya. Here, however, he's talking about how the nefesh halikis ultimately influences and impresses upon the nefesh habamis to go along and ultimately be affected by the midas, the ava of Telakus. Just wanted to give a practical example to make it a lot more something that everybody can actually implement. And that's essentially how the nefesh halikis and nefesh works with the nefesh habamis. And if you do that, that's the method that Chassidus Chabad teaches us how to become a more refined person. It's Aveda. It doesn't just happen because you say, one morning you wake up and say, I want to be more refined. I want to be less selfish. I want to be less materialistic, less indulgent, and so on. It comes with a process. Okay. So now he continues. He says, Aval, on the third line of the new paragraph on page 1465. So he said two things. First comes the Yavam V'Yasig, understanding, and then when the midas get aroused or the midas get stimulated, the midas of the Nefesh Halikis are awakened, that it will impact Mispal. The Nefesh Habamis will also be affected by that. Aval im lo yihi asogas ha-seichel hativi. But let's say you skip that step of seichel hativi. If there would have been any natural understanding of the natural mind of the inyan eliki, sheyovenes ha'inyan, to understand this inyan eliki that the nefesh halikis is introducing, gam im ha'seichel the nefesh halikis mevenu masik. So then, even if the nefesh halikis, the seichel, the intelligence of the divine soul, understands and comprehends, umizbeinin b'zeh betuv, and contemplates in a good way, in a thorough way, or in a betuv, in a complete way, v'gam mispal ba'ava. And the Nefesh Elokis is also excited by it, gets stimulated with love. Nevertheless, because it didn't go through Seichel HaTivi, lo yiful mu'uma b'na nefesh habamis. It will not have any impact on the animal soul. She'ein es nizuz mimkeme. Because it's not being shifted from its place. Nefesh habamis remains where it was. So maybe it may see the spilus of the Nefesh Elokis, and all of that, but it's not its language. It's like speaking a different language. Imagine Nefesh Habamis is listening to someone speak, excited and passionate, but it's a language Nefesh Habamis doesn't understand. It's the Seichel HaTivi that of the Inyan Eliki that the Nefesh Elokis is engaging with, that allows the Nefesh Habamis, that translates it into the language of the Nefesh Habamis. And he says, interesting, Ma'uma, that even if the Nefesh Elokis is contemplating it well and understands it well, and it's already stimulated. We're not just saying Nefesh Elokis understands. It's actually experiencing a love for godliness. It would not affect at all the Nefesh Habamis. Le'zaz came in, le'nizuz came, like you say, le'poga v'le'noga. Doesn't say that expression here, but it means no shift. There was no adjustment, nothing, no movement. Le'nizuz mimkeme. However, the Rebbe Rashab does qualify it in the parentheses. V'yochel rak b'derech lishus. It's possible that when the Nefesh Elokis is alive in that fashion, all come alive, that the Nefesh Habamis will be weakened. Yochelius. That the power of the Nefesh Habamis won't be that intense. It'll be weakened due to this Gili of the Nefesh Elokis. Obviously, if the Nefesh Elokis is asleep or not doing anything, so Nefesh Habamis can run wild, it's in control. But once the person, remember there's only one person here, can't be doing two things at once. Once he's engaged and involved in the understanding of a divine concept, and that is affecting his midas, so Nefesh Habamis is weakened, is somewhat tamed, somewhat suppressed. Chalishus is the word he's saying because of the Gilead Nefesh Elokis. So that the Rebbe Rashab says that's possible. That's the qualification. So it doesn't have an impact on Nefesh Habamis in any direct way, but it weakens its influence. It weakens its power, at least to that, of course, only in that moment. So now about the other way around. What happens if you only have hasaga? Let's say the Nefesh Elokis explains the idea in a way that the Inyan Eliki, and it's very understandable, but there's no mission, there's no hised to the Samidus. So he said, if the Aveda will be only on the intellectual and the cognitive level, meaning with the understanding, a divine understanding of the divine, and the Seichel is also excited, the Seichel, not the Midas. So he's going down the other extreme. Let's say you only have the Seichel, you understand it well, and your mind is even excited about it, but it's an intellectual excitement, like we learned earlier. But there's no Ispailus Amidis. You don't see an emotional passion in the heart. So lo yifel gamkein. That too will not impact al Amidis the Nefesh Habamis, on the Midas of Nefesh Habamis. The Seichel Nefesh Habamis could be impacted because it understands the idea as well. But if you want the Midas of the Nefesh Habamis to come alive, even if the Nefesh Habamis also understands it with its natural intelligence, but its midas will not be affected. We need to have both. You need to have the hisbonenus in a way that the Nefesh Habamis understands it, and you need to have the midas of the Nefesh Elokis come alive, so the Nefesh Habamis is then impacted by those midas. And it too will be able to feel. So it's like here listening to a teacher who philosophizes about something, and you understand it well, but you don't see the teacher living by it. You don't see him passionate about it. You see he understands well. It's an intellectual exercise, an academic exercise. So your the academic side of the Seichel HaTivi of the Nefesh Habamis appreciates it. But then you see the teacher come alive. They didn't just teach a nice idea, but the way he davens, the way he's passionate about loving other people, Avos Yisrael, Avos Hashem. Then the Nefesh Habamis Midas, being that the Seichel has already understood, are responsive and will be affected by the Midas of the Nefesh Elikis. Okay. Let me stop for any questions. Very clear, I think, very even balabatishly spelled out. But still, if anybody wants to clarify any points here, because frankly, this is something that can be implemented by each one of us. Everyone obviously relative to their level, but it's a very practical blueprint here. Like I said, methodology. Are there any questions? Okay. So now comes a parentheses. Let's see how long this parentheses is. Okay, it's around 10 lines. Or 9 lines. Okay, so let's learn the parentheses where the Rebbe Rashab is going to further develop this, break it down, qualify things, as he is customary in doing. So he says, "V'yachal liyas." I'm sorry, the Shneim Dafke. V'yachal liyas. Another yachal liyas. Before was yachal liyas that it's possible to weaken the nefesh habamis. Now he's saying v'yachal liyas shebezeh yesh yisen b'nefesh habamis. And it's possible that here there's an advantage actually in the animal soul. Because till now we've been talking how the Nefesh Elikis is triggering all of this. It's all triggered by the Nefesh Elikis contemplating on a divine concept, understanding it with natural intelligence, meaning intelligence from this world, Dvarim Tivim, that the Nefesh Habamis can understand. And then the spilus of the midas of Nefesh Elikis. But now he's saying there's an advantage in this process in the Nefesh Habamis. Shahari b'Nefesh Elikis, because when you're talking about the divine soul, hine aveda b'meichin, the aveda in the meichin of the divine soul, meaning the divine soul contemplating on a divine idea. The gamma fili spilus sichli, and even the spilus, the intellectual excitement that the mind has when it appreciates a beautiful concept, divine concept. You know, I talk about seviv klam and malaklam and a lot of ideas that we learn. And the mind is very excited about it. It's very intriguing. It's very stimulating. So he says, "Ein zeh shayches lepeil." Nefesh Elikis on its own, doesn't have a shayches to action. Because the divine soul is contemplating on Elikus, beautiful. It's getting excited by it, but it's not shayches lepeil. We'll soon see what he means by that. Whereas the Nefesh Habamis is going to say, he's going to add something the Nefesh Elikis doesn't have here. And what's that? Well, it continues to explain. This is chapter 16 in Tanya. So there, I'll explain, I'll read inside, then I'll explain what he says there. Which is the Aramaic for love and reverence. Actually, reverence and love. Tchilu is yira in Aramaic, and rechimu is love in Aramaic. So tchilu rechimu, there he talks about in Tanya, shebetfunas meiche v'talumas libei, govu ma'alosan mahamaisa. Their quality is higher than action. So let me explain what this means. It's a little introduction here. In Tanya, in that part of Tanya, he's talking at length there. So what do we do with the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Habamis? Being that they're diametric opposites and they're battle with each other. So yes, during davening, as he explains, Nefesh Elikis gets empowered from the power of davening, which is the Eis Rotzen, the auspicious time of Tefillah. That's the Shman Tefillah v'Krishma in chapter 12. And that in turn gives the Nefesh Elikis fuel, so to speak, to really focus on Hashem and bring ta'ava And the nefesh habamis there in Tanya is basically pushed aside because it doesn't have a say when the nefesh halikis is so alive. Here he's talking about it does affect it, but that's not a contradiction; it's just different stages. But then what happens after davening? After davening, so he says, now you need moyach shalat al-lev. You need to constantly control. The nefesh halikis has to continuously try to show and that the seichel of the nefesh halikis is to serve God is superior than serving yourself. And he goes on to explain that the process works, that when you contemplate on that, it awakens midas, it gives birth to midas of ava and yira. And that's ultimately the avodah. But then in chapter 16, he says what happens with a person who, as much as he contemplates, he cannot arouse within himself real passionate midas. You can have that. A person can understand something and appreciate it, but it doesn't affect, it doesn't really get you going. Whatever the reason may be. So the Alter Rebbe introduces a level below passionate midas. He calls it midas tchiler rechimu shebetalumes libay. Betfunes meche vetalumes libay. Which means that your mind understands the idea and understand that it's worthy of loving God. He says, Ya'asalai. So you don't necessarily feel the love, but you feel that it's worthy to love. And that's the solution when a person is not quite there yet. At least contemplate and try to get your emotions to be open to the idea it's worthy. I mentioned before the mediation example. One person may not like the other because they had a run-in or they had a conflict. But once you really start the work, the process, what you want them is to say, is it possible? Do you think that you guys can work together again? So one person may say, I don't feel that way right now, but I think it's possible. As soon as they say it's possible, you already have an opening. If they say it's impossible, then you're still stuck in a place where the midas are not open. So the Alter Rebbe is introducing in chapter 16 the possibility that it's not bizgalus libay. That's called midas that are fully alive and fully passionate. Is betfunes meche and betalumis libay. So in the heart there is an emotion, but it's not a full-blown feeling of love, but it's a feeling that it's worthy to love God because not only because but it's not just an intellectual thing because it makes sense. Because it makes sense emotionally, it also makes sense. Even though you cannot yet see the fiery flames of a passionate love. So it's a further step where the intellect has influenced the emotions, but it's not come to full-blown emotions yet. That's what he says in that piece in Tanya. So then he goes on to say, and that's not meaningless. On the contrary, the fact that you did that, even though it's not a full-blown emotion, he says is even greater. That's what he says. That Gova malosa ma maisa. Because let's say a person says, I don't feel it, but I'll do it anyway. Like in the case, let's say the mediation, the person says, I don't feel close to this person, but in the name of peace, I'll follow whatever you tell me to do. Or in the case of an Aveda, the Nefesh Habam, the person rather, will say, I don't feel love for Hashem, but nevertheless, I'll do a mitzvah because that's a Kabbalah sale or whatever the reason is. So he's saying the fact that you're responsive, that it's possible, that it makes sense, that it's appropriate, it's fitting. Even emotionally, you see the value of loving God is in some way greater than action itself. Why? Because it changes the person. The person is beginning to love, as he explains there. So the Rebbe Rashab goes on. So that's beside the Nefesh Halikis. So what do you see from that? That the Nefesh Halikis can be inspired by contemplating, but it doesn't necessarily come to Maisa, because it only remains like it makes sense. Ubenefesh habamis kesher masig besichle inyan eliki. However, when the Nefesh Habamis understands, comprehends an inyan eliki, a divine idea, v'huskam etzlei besichle hatev. Besichle, hatev delikus. and he's agreeable. He's accepted, and it's agreeable to him. It's even more than agreeable. It means that he is appreciating in his seichel of the nefesh habamis the goodness of godliness. Love, it actually has an impact. So the nefesh halikisa may not have an impact in action, but the nefesh habamis, it has an impact. As a poil of lotzeis min achumrius, it can impacts him to go away from the chumrius, the crassness of the materialistic desires and passions that he has. Shelo yirtze b'inyanim elu, that he shouldn't want them. V'hu liyis, and why is that? Because the haseichel and nefesh habamis hu rak sheshayich lemidas kanal. So here's an interesting twist. Why? Because remember, the seichel of the nefesh habamis, as we learned earlier, even the seichel is all around midas. It's all around my own needs or gashmias and yeshus. The nefesh halikis, its seichel is about godliness. So ironically, the godliness that the seichel nefesh halikis is experiencing, and the midas and the seichel the hispilus seichel can keep it in that domain. The nefesh habamis, once seichel is affected, seichel of nefesh habamis immediately is connected to its own interests. So the seichel of nefesh habamis, appreciating godliness, causes it to somewhat remove itself from its natural animalistic and materialistic desires. That's what he's saying. Val kain, and therefore haseichel v'asoga shalei poel al amides, and that's why the seichel hasoga of the animal soul, its intelligence and its comprehension, affects the midas, whereas the nefesh halikis not necessarily. V'hainu, and now he spells it out even more so, because once the nefesh, remember the nefesh halikis is divine, always divine. But when it contemplates on divine and gets excited, it's in its natural waters. The nefesh habamis on its own does not appreciate the divine. Now that it does, so nefesh habamis has learned a new reality. Nefesh halikis has not learned about a new reality. It's just swimming in its own natural waters, as I said. But the nefesh habamis has now been introduced to a divine thing that intrigues it, and therefore it affects it. And nefesh halikis, like it's a novelty. The nefesh habamis suddenly realizes, I thought my reality was only materialism. I realized that there's a whole spiritual forces at work behind the scenes. There's a koyach haliki, and I'm talking now purely on a seichel level. Nefesh habamis hears that, it's like another reality. It takes away some of the passion, the chayis, the vitality, the passion, the energy from the inyanim gashmin that the nefesh habamis is naturally inclined to. Esnem be'emsu, and it's not a surprise the Rebbe Rasha immediately adds Yiddish here, because it's such a powerful statement that he's making. He wants to, like he said, the nefesh habamis versteht besser Yiddish. So Yiddish has a certain touch. So he says, Esnem ba'emtsu dem geschmack von den inyanim hachumrim. It takes away, it removes from him the geschmack, the pleasure of inyanim hachumrim, of very crass materialistic desires. It's like a person, for example, just a simple example, when a child can be playing with little toys. An adult is not going to play with toys. Why? Because your mind has expanded, and little toys have no interest. It's meaningless to you. That doesn't mean you don't have your own adult toys. You know, people could have things they could play with money, with other things. Some people like a very good steak. But when you start appreciating the mind of the nefesh habamis, that there's something spiritual, and you sense its value, it starts weakening the hold of gashmis and chumris on you. It's somewhat like what the Frierdiker Rebbe said, that this toy, he was talking about a gun, can frighten someone who has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds, or two worlds. As soon as you know there's another world called Ruchnius, the hold of Gashmis becomes weaker. And we're talking about really appreciating. We're not talking about a superficial awareness. In other words, you become by nature more refined because you see there's another reality, even the nefesh habamis. And the contrary, dafka the nefesh habamis. Aval b'chdei lias le'avel le'lakus. Okay, so what happened here is, he's saying in this parenthesis, so nefesh habamis has a quality nefesh halikis does not have. because as when it understands a divine thing, it right away changes its personality to some extent, that it weakens the hold, like he says, takes away some of the passion from Elam Hazah. But in order for it to have Avid Talakus, that's another story. That then the animal soul should actually have passion for godliness. Says Zeu Dafka Yedei Spilus Ha'avid the Nefesh Elikis. That it requires that the Nefesh Elikis come alive with Ava. So he's saying there's in one step the Nefesh Abamis has a quality over the Nefesh Elikis because it's taken it away from that strong hold of Gashmius and Chumrius. But you still have to get it to love God, and that needs the Nefesh Elikis does not get inspired emotionally. The Nefesh Abamis will not be able to have Avat Alakus. It appreciates it, and it weakens the hold. But the Avat Alakus, that requires the second step. So that's what he added here in this parenthesis, which is quite fascinating, actually. How the Nefesh Abamis, because as I said, it's like when a person who is a completely refined person is always doing good. So when they learn something and appreciate something, it's going to have an effect, but it's not going to be as obvious. If a person who's very crass and very unrefined, and they suddenly discover another reality, you're going to see progress immediately. It's like what they call, I don't want to call it beginner's luck, but someone who's living in the dark, when they see light, it's going to have a stronger impact than someone who's living in the light. Even though the Nefesh Elikis also has to grow, but the Nefesh Elikis begins in light, doesn't fully impact it so much, whereas darkness, or the crassness of the animal soul is impacted. But yet we still need the next step of the Ava of the Nefesh Elikis to impact it. And that concludes the parentheses. Okay, any questions on this? All clear? Good.
Not
And now
really,
I'm sorry.
but I would like to do it off the line later.
Okay. And now the Rebbe Rashab goes back to the very moshel that he began from the Maimer HaMagbi on the top of page 1463, that Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom is what? Is the psila, the wick of the divine soul, inserted in the oil, which is the wisdom, intelligence of the animal soul. And the job is to transform that oil from instead of it using its oil, its wisdom, for its own interests, or for Gashmis and Chumris, to turn it into fuel that leads to the flame of the candle, which is the Ava Kaddish Be'esh, the fiery flame of love and passion for godliness. So now he takes us back to that. He says, V'zeu inyan hashemen. Now we'll understand. This is the inyan of the oil, the fuel. Shanim shachachar psila, that is drawn and follows the wick. That is drawn into the wick. Hainu, this shemen, this oil is the natural intelligence of the animal soul. That's now following and taking the lead, being guided by the seichel nefesh elikis, like the wick is drawing and absorbing the oil. So the oil of the nefesh abamis, by hearing and listening to the seichel of the nefesh elikis, which is melubish, which manifests in natural intelligence, meaning intelligence about matters that the Nefesh Abamis fully appreciates, that's the meaning of the shemen being drawn toward the wick. V'hainu masha Nefesh Elikis, which what is that? What does it come down to be? When it does that, it creates a flame. And that's what the Nefesh Elikis, the divine soul, mamshich eirei haliki. So what is the Nefesh Elikis doing? It's mamshich, it's drawing. It's the Eir Eliki, the divine light, b'seichel v'hasagas halakus, in its intelligence and its comprehension of godliness, gam b'seichel ativi de nefesh abamis. Also in the natural seichel intelligence of the animal soul, of the oil. V'ozai, and when that's done, memela b'yiseidus ha'avad de nefesh elikis. Once you've warmed up, so to speak, and prime the animal soul, and it's appreciating godliness. The shemen is now entering into the wick. The oil is being drawn and absorbed into the wick. Then when you ignite the flame, which means that nefesh halikis gets excited. Gama nefesh abam is when there's an awakening of the love, which means the flame of love of the nefesh halikis, you spoil gam hanefesh abam is ba'avel Hashem. Also, the animal soul will be excited with a love to God. Shezein b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. And that's the in v'haftas Hashem alekecha b'chol levavcha, not just b'chol lipcha, with two bases. B'chol levavcha, with both sides of the heart, the right side and the left side. The nefesh halikis and nefesh habam is the yetzer teiv and the yetzer hara. And here's where I'll stop. So here you have basically a 3-page almost explanation with the Mittler Rebbe's additions and the Rebbe Rashab, of course, elaborating on that piece in Torah in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer of Hamagbi about what is the process of Ner Hashem Nishmas Sodom, the 3 things: the wick, the oil, and creating that flame of love that he's describing here. Okay, so I'll stop here by the period. So we're 7 lines from the bottom of page 1465. Are there any questions on this what we've learned here? Okay, so we'll stop there.